My dad and I talk a lot about my recovery, specifically my recovery from having psychiatric disabilities. And I have borderline personality disorder, CPTSD, and schizoaffective disorder, which combined are a recipe for a very challenging life. One thing we talk about specifically, which has really resonated with me, is maladaptive coping mechanisms. Maladaptive coping mechanisms are essentially harmful ways that people cope. So ways that would hurt them or others. This can look like a myriad of things, including binge eating, gambling, excessive drinking and drug use, or even reckless sexual behaviors. And in my case, my go-to coping mechanism that has been particularly harmful to me has historically been self-harm. I recently got to the milestone of going a year without self-harm, and it was challenging. There were certainly times during that year that I wanted to self-harm and had to choose healthier coping mechanisms, had to learn and adapt ways of coping that were healthier, and it was new. It was hard to adopt because I hadn't been familiar with these skills. And when I'm in a heightened state where my go-to is a habit that I formed over years and years and years, breaking that habit to try something new is incredibly hard. I used to have a lot of impulsivity around my self-harm habits, and it was something that I didn't think twice about. It was a tool to me to stop crying, to calm down, to feel better. And while it was a temporary relief, it had long-lasting effects, not just the physical visibility of scars on my body, but also the internal shame and guilt and self-loathing that came with acting like that to myself. I started self-harming when I was in college, and this was 2013, so 10 years ago now, which means that my self-harm journey lasted about 9 years. And in that time that I was in college, I was grappling with a lot of mental health issues. I was coming into having PTSD symptoms. I did not know that I had PTSD, and it had all culminated to the point where after a lifelong series of tragic events, I was finally having the feelings and symptoms come to the surface. So I was having flashbacks, I was having anxiety and panic attacks. This would often happen on campus in front of other people, right from the start of my first week of school, which left me ostracized and bullied by the other students who didn't understand that I was not just acting for attention, I was actually in distress. And the bullying left me entirely isolated, very alone, very much depressed. And that, on top of the symptoms already started, I could not cope, and I turned to something I swore I'd never do, and that was self-harm. The first time I did it, I was admittedly scared, and I had this feeling of fuck it, just throw it all away, just give up, just give in. It is not worth fighting anymore, just succumb to it. So I hadn't really premeditated this. I just happened to be walking by a cork board and saw a push pin and thought, yeah, that'll do. And that was the beginning for me. I always self-harmed on my legs because it was easier to hide, and I was doing it in secret for a really long time. I ultimately left college because of the bullying, and also because these symptoms that I did not know were PTSD were overbearing and impossible to live with. I knew what PTSD was, I knew what the symptoms were, I did not see how it applied to me. So after dropping out of college and going into therapy, I found out that I actually had PTSD. And not only that, I had CPTSD, which my therapist, or whoever she was, described as PTSD on steroids. And this made sense, but not at first, because I didn't realize I'd even had trauma. My protective barriers in my mind had done such a good job of detaching me from my life experiences that I could not recognize how the sexual assault, the physical abuse, the neglect were all a part of my mental illness that was now presented as PTSD. I did not know that was trauma because I just thought these things were normal. The symptoms really came out when I had agoraphobia, and that was a time when my self-harm was at its peak, and I was actually having to go to the hospital for my self-harm, and I was having to go to a crisis center repeatedly to calm down and stop myself from hurting myself. But inevitably, when I'd come home, I would start again, and it was relief. It's this interesting thing that I hear a lot of people say, that it doesn't actually physically hurt. And it really didn't to me. It was a sensation, but it wasn't that painful. It was uncomfortable, but the relief that I felt as soon as it happened was what I was seeking. And it was at times the only thing that could calm me down. When nothing else worked, when no other coping mechanism could solve the distress I was in, it always, 100% of the time, was effective in stopping any episode I was in. Despite gaining stability over the course of my recovery, I did not let go of this habit. This was still my comfort, and I got up on my feet. I was able to move into a sober living house where I had more independence and accountability and responsibility. I was learning how to do things by myself that I had never done before. Simple adult things like getting the groceries by myself, riding the bus. I had been too sheltered for too long to know how to do things like set up appointments and pick up my meds. And I was learning all of these things, and I was growing. I was actually growing for the first time, but I still fell back on this habit the second anything wrong happened. It could be anything from being rejected by a boy that I liked to having some sort of confrontation with a person or having a friend betray me. I did not know how to handle these things. Like, I could not have the emotional intelligence or capacity to recognize what I was feeling and decide what to do about it. Like, journaling didn't help, talking about it in therapy didn't help, because I wasn't at a place yet where I understood my emotions enough to identify them, right? So while I could feel big things, it was too big for me to comprehend, and I would shut down, and I would kind of just like go into this shut off mode where, you know, I was either in a blind rage and I was reckless, or I was full on dissociating. And that feeling of, you know, whatever chaos was happening was unnamed to me because I just was too distressed to recognize it. I knew I felt bad. I knew I felt chaotic, but I didn't know if I felt ashamed, if I felt guilty, if I felt jealous, if I felt self-conscious, if I felt any number of intelligible feelings. They were unfamiliar to me. I finally did stop for a time and was successful in handling my emotions in healthier ways. However, in that time, I had a psychotic episode. And in one of my previous videos, I talked about how during my psychotic episode, I married a predatory man. Well, during that marriage, he really bore down on me and would tear me to pieces and really just belittle me and condescend towards me. I felt so little in that relationship. I felt so broken and beaten down. He would constantly be telling me that I was fat. He would tell me that I was the most selfish person he'd ever met. And that is not how a healthy relationship goes. That is not how you effectively communicate to your partner. Putting them down is just a recipe for bringing up old trauma and triggers because it reminded me of how I was raised and the way I'd been treated in the past. And I was just, you know, scolded one too many times and admonished one too many times. And coped in what had worked for me in the past, because nothing I had learned was working now. I self-harmed and he retaliated. We had a fight because I had self-harmed, and he was particularly mean in this fight. Well, it wasn't really resolved. I ultimately just went back to sleep, and he shook me awake around 3 a.m. and was a little bit erratic and was saying, hey, wake up, I have something to show you. I'm like, okay, what? And he's like, I played a game of tic-tac-toe against myself. And I'm like, okay. And he showed me that he had a trigger warning, skip ahead about like a minute past this mark, because what I'm about to say is a little visual, but he had carved a tic-tac-toe board into his thigh and had literally carved a game of tic-tac-toe. And he said, this is what it feels like when someone you love cuts themselves. So he full on did that to retaliate and teach me a lesson. And I found that to be shocking and terrifying, and ultimately, upon processing it later, a very manipulative tactic in keeping me in line. So from that moment forward, I was too scared to self-harm in that relationship. And that fear carried forward for quite a few months. And I was in remission, I guess you could say, but I fell into it after I left the relationship. I was doing it more and more and more, especially coping with that relationship and the trauma that came with that marriage. And I really didn't want to. Like in the past, I didn't care about my body, and I didn't care that I was doing it because I didn't love myself. I didn't love myself at this point either, but I did like myself enough that I didn't want to do that anymore. Except at this point, it had become an addiction and I just couldn't stop. Much as I wanted to, I couldn't stop. For the next 3 years, I struggled with stopping. I would stop for a month, and that would be a long time for me. And I would stop for 3 or 4 months, and that would be a long time for me, but I could never make it any further than that. And I was trying to hold myself accountable, announcing to people, hey, I got 30 days, but I was saying that month after month after month. And what I thought was going to be a great effective way at keeping me in line just became somewhat of an embarrassment. However, I kept holding myself accountable when I got those milestones of 30, 60, or 90 days, and I would announce it at my meetings because I knew that it was helping in some small way, and that if I held myself accountable, or at least could tangibly see how much progress I was or wasn't making, I could be on the right track towards stopping. Ultimately, I stopped on November 2nd, 2022. And the reason that this was the day that I chose to be the last day I ever self-harmed was because it was my grandpa's birthday. Now, my grandpa was the most significant person in my life, and I loved him more than anyone I'd ever known. We had a very special bond that was really pure and rare that no one could touch. His favorite person in life was my grandma, and I was his close second, and everybody respected that we had this very special relationship. When he died, I was broken and devastated, and I was still self-harming, feeling especially guilty because I wanted to honor his memory. But when I self-harmed on his birthday, I felt so horrible for doing that. And I hadn't called my grandma that day, which I always did, to talk about him with her. I felt so horrible that I said, you know, there could be nothing worse than doing this again. If I were to stop on this day and stay stopped, it would be for a reason. This would be something. But if I were to ever to do this again, that would completely ruin the entire sentiment, and it would have ultimately put like a rain cloud over that day, and that would forever be a negative day in my mind that I had done something wrong. So I know that's sort of self-deprecating. It was, however, my motivation and got me through to this year mark where now it's been a little over a year and I have stopped, and I hope to stay stopped And I ultimately feel like the only way I could do it was by honoring his memory. In this year, I have learned how to not use that skill, like to find better ways of handling my distress, because just because I stopped self-harming doesn't mean that I don't still have distress in my life. As I said, I have borderline personality disorder and CPTSD, which is very explosive at times. Flashbacks are very distressing, rage episodes are very distressing, and teaching myself how to deal with that in a healthier way was enormously challenging, but ultimately so worth it. I taught myself therapy techniques. What I did is I would go on YouTube and I would look up videos about dialectical behavioral therapy, because that is very much an action type therapy of things you can do for yourself. I learned distress tolerance techniques, and what I did is I wrote down all of my favorite ones and made flashcards out of them so that I could look at them when I needed them. I realized that if I was in a distressful state of mind, I could not remember what I'd learned in a calm state of mind. But if I wrote it down, I could look at it and choose something to cope with, and it would help. These are my cards, and there's a lot of them, and they have all sorts of great distress tolerance techniques. Read a book, laugh until you cry, take a bubble bath, put on some comfy clothes. There are others that are more like especially geared towards self-harm, like draw on yourself, paint on yourself, hold an ice cube, take a hot shower, things like that. And I have found it to be incredibly effective. And it went a step further. I did make like a whole bag that I call my therapy bag, which had the cards in it, as well as sensory items like little stuffed animals, essential oils, pretty rocks to play with and look at, a journal, and markers to draw and write. And that was something that really, really helped me in the beginning. I was actually using this, and it was a huge milestone for me. Another thing I did is I tracked my progress in a journal. So I kept a log of every single thing I did in a day to see what was helping, what routine was working, and what sort of events triggered any rage episode or mood episode in a day. So I would write down, for instance, woke up at 9 a.m., had breakfast at 9:15, took a shower at 9:30. I would write what I ate. I would write if I took a nap. I'd write for how long. I would write whatever activities I did. And in the event that I'd have some sort of an episode, I would write down how long it lasted, when it happened, the severity on a scale of 1 to 10, and what I did to cope. And seeing on paper what I did to cope each time let me see a pattern of what coping skills I was leaning towards the most, that were the most helpful to me. And using this log taught me what my habits were, so that I could see what these triggers were that I couldn't identify before, to identify these emotions, like I'd said, that I was too overwhelmed to understand. I could finally put these things on paper and have an answer for why I was cutting in the first place. It was a productive year for me, and I made a lot of growth. In fact, I'd say I grew 3 times as much with my progress, because I wasn't holding on to an old part of how mentally ill I had been before anymore. Back when I first found out I had PTSD and went into agoraphobia, I was pretty much devastated in my life, and I was incapacitated by how severely disabled I had become. And while I still have my limitations and struggles, and I'm still disabled, I cope and manage and am capable of so much more. and carrying that with me, that habit from a time when my life was so bleak, when my world was so small, was doing me no favors. It is incredibly hard to stop self-harming once you've started. I think a lot of people think it's an attention-seeking thing, or they think it's out of suicidality. But for me, it was purely a coping mechanism, a maladaptive coping mechanism, as my dad would say. And yeah, it was an addiction to me. I've quit a lot of things. I quit cigarettes. That was pretty hard. I quit drugs, also very hard. But self-harm, for some reason, was the one thing that really challenged me to put down. That was my kryptonite. So to anyone struggling with self-harm, I just want to say that you deserve better, and that you're worth it, and that your body deserves better and is worth it too. You deserve to have a body that you love, that you feel safe in, that you don't feel ashamed of or feel like you have to hide. And yeah, it is hard. It's really hard to find new ways to cope, especially with such overwhelming emotions. But it is possible, and it takes a lot of hard work, but it's worth putting in the effort. So I would encourage you to reach out to anyone, for help, find resources. Like I said, dialectical behavioral therapy helped me a lot, and there's a workbook out there to teach you how to use it. Therapy and, coping skills, distress tolerance techniques, logging your emotions, they all go a long way in helping you recover and go into remission from self-harm.